died in 1999, but came back in 2025 without explanation. I woke up to a bright light, my eyes struggling to adjust to the unfamiliar surroundings. The sterile scent of disinfectant assaulted my senses, and I could feel the harsh hum of machines, though nothing seemed to be happening around me. The beeping of a heart monitor echoed through the room, setting my pulse to a frantic rhythm as I tried to sit up, only to be stopped by a sharp pain in my chest. It felt like my chest was being pressed down by an invisible weight, and the realization hit me like a punch. I was alive. But why? How? The last thing I remembered was a feeling of intense pain, sharp, unforgiving, before everything faded into darkness. The night I died. But now, here I was, breathing, alive, in a room that didn't belong to the 1999 world I once knew. My hand instinctively reached to touch my face, my fingers grazing the unfamiliar contours. This wasn't my body, not entirely. It was as if my very soul had been reshuffled, and I wasn't sure who I was anymore. The disorientation was so thick it almost choked me. I glanced around, trying to gather my bearings. The room itself was clinical, with white walls and fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead. But something was off about it. The machines around me looked advanced, sleeker, more streamlined than anything I had ever seen. The bed was not like any hospital bed I remembered. It seemed to have more features, buttons I didn't recognize, displays that flickered with information I couldn't comprehend. My heart rate quickened, my thoughts racing. How long had I been out? The calendar on the wall caught my eye. 2025. It felt as if the ground had shifted beneath me, pulling me into a reality I didn't understand. 25 years had passed. I had to remind myself that I had died. That's what everyone said, and I had believed it. The doctors, the paramedics, even the funeral home. They had all prepared for my final moments. I had left this world, my family, my friends. Everyone thought I was gone. But now, I was here, alive. Confusion and panic swept over me, and I felt the urge to bolt from the bed. But the pain in my chest returned, forcing me to lie back down. What happened to me? Was this some sort of miracle? A second chance? Or was there something more sinister at play here? I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breath. I could hear voices outside my room, quiet murmurs that only added to the weight of the unknown pressing down on me. Who were they? Were they waiting for me to wake up? Was someone going to explain what had happened? Then, the door to my room opened, and a woman stepped inside. She looked vaguely familiar, but her face was blurred in my memory, as if she belonged to a past life I couldn't fully recall. Her eyes widened the moment she saw me. "You're awake," she said, her voice trembling with disbelief. "Oh my God, I thought you were gone forever." I wanted to ask her a million questions. Who was she? How did she know me? Why did she look at me like I was a ghost? But I couldn't form the words. My mind was still a storm of confusion, memories drifting like smoke just out of reach. She stepped closer, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch mine. "I can't believe this," she muttered under her breath, almost to herself. You don't look like yourself. Not at all." I tried to speak, but my throat was dry. My words caught somewhere between shock and fear. Who are you?" Her eyes widened further, and she took a step back, as if I had slapped her with the question. She looked at me with a mixture of fear and pity, as though I were some sort of stranger in my own skin. "What do you mean? Who am I?" "I'm your sister, Emily. We've been waiting for you to come back." Emily. The name echoed in my mind, but it didn't bring the comfort it should have. I should have known her. I should have remembered. But nothing felt right. Nothing seemed to match up. There were gaps in my memory, pieces of a puzzle I couldn't put together. My heart was still racing, and the panic was creeping back into my chest. I felt as though I had been dropped into a reality that didn't make sense. A reality where the past and present were tangled together, where time had shifted, and everything I thought I knew had become uncertain. What happened? I finally managed to whisper. Where am I? How did I get here? She looked at me like I had asked her to explain the meaning of life in a single sentence. Then she seemed to gather herself, pushing her emotions down. You died. You died in 1999. I was there. We buried you. But now you're back. And I don't know how. 1999. It felt like a lifetime ago. It was a lifetime ago. The world I remembered, the people I knew, everything had been left behind in the past. But now I was alive again, in 2025. It made no sense. How could I have died and returned to this strange new world? I glanced around the room, my gaze falling on the calendar again. 2025. I had missed so much. 25 years. Had I really been gone that long? My sister seemed to notice the shift in my expression and walked closer, her voice now softer, almost hesitant. You don't remember, do you? What happened? What you saw? I shook my head, the confusion overwhelming. I don't even know who I am anymore. What's happening to me? The days that followed were a blur, each moment bleeding into the next. I spent most of my time in the hospital, trying to understand the reality I had been thrust into. Emily, my sister, visited me daily, but the more I saw her, the more I felt like I was looking at a stranger. It wasn't her fault. She had been mourning my death for years, and here I was, someone who looked like her brother but wasn't quite the same. She kept telling me how glad she was that I was back, but I could see the hesitation in her eyes. She didn't trust me, not fully, and I didn't trust myself. It was clear that something had happened to me, something that had altered my very being. My memories were fragmented, like pieces of a broken mirror, and each attempt to put them together only seemed to reveal more cracks. I couldn't even remember what had happened to me in the final moments before my death. I had no recollection of the hospital, the funeral, or the years that followed. All I knew was that I had woken up in a future I couldn't comprehend. The world outside the hospital was unrecognizable. The city I once knew was a shadow of what it had been. The streets were lined with towering buildings that seemed to scrape the sky, their glass facades shimmering in the sunlight. Technology had advanced at a dizzying pace. I could see people walking with strange devices in their hands, communicating with one another without ever speaking. The air was filled with the hum of drones flying overhead, carrying out tasks I couldn't quite understand. But it wasn't just the world that had changed, it was me. My body felt different, like it didn't quite belong to me. My hands were colder, my skin paler. I had moments of dizziness, flashes of disorientation, as though my mind were fighting against a reality it couldn't accept. But what scared me the most were the dreams. They weren't just dreams, they were memories. Or perhaps they were visions. Visions of a past I didn't remember, of a future that hadn't come to pass yet. I saw myself standing in places I had never been, desolate landscapes, crumbling cities, and vast stretches of wilderness that seemed to stretch on forever. In these dreams, I was never alone. There were others with me, people who seemed familiar yet distant, as if they belonged to a different version of my life. And there was always a figure watching from the shadows, a man whose face I couldn't quite make out, but whose presence was suffocating. Who was he? The figure's eyes, if I could even call them eyes, seemed to pierce through the darkness, through the very fabric of reality. And every time I encountered him, I felt a sense of dread wash over me, as though I were being hunted. But the worst part? He always spoke in riddles, words that made no sense, yet carried a weight I couldn't ignore. "You're not meant to be here," he would say. "The timeline has been broken. You are the key, but you are also the lock." The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I was trapped in something much bigger than myself, something I couldn't even begin to understand. I was no longer sure of my own identity. The man in the shadows, he knew something I didn't. He had to, but no matter how much I tried to remember, the fragments of my past refused to fit together. I would wake up in cold sweats, my heart pounding in my chest, only to find myself in a world that felt increasingly alien. I couldn't explain what was happening to me, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever had brought me back was part of something far more complex than I could comprehend. And then came the messages. They started off small, little signs that I tried to dismiss as coincidence. A flickering light in the corner of my room, a strange pattern in the clouds outside the window, but they escalated quickly. One night, while I was alone in my apartment, a knock at the door startled me. When I opened it, no one was there, but on the doorstep lay an envelope, sealed with a symbol I didn't recognize. I opened it, hands trembling, and inside was a single sheet of paper. The words were cryptic, written in a language I couldn't understand, but there was one line I could make out. "They're watching you. Don't trust anyone." I scanned the room, a chill running down my spine. Who had left this? And why? The message felt like a warning that someone or something was aware of my return. I was being hunted. The thought gnawed at me. I wasn't sure whether I was being paranoid or if there was something truly sinister at play. Emily didn't believe me when I told her about the message. She just shook her head and told me it was probably just a prank. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I wasn't just some ordinary man who had returned from the dead. Something had changed. I had changed. As the days wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. No matter where I went, I felt like eyes were on me, hidden in the shadows. My life in 2025 was a waking nightmare, a world I didn't recognize, with people I couldn't trust, and memories that wouldn't return. But the worst part, I wasn't sure if I even wanted the truth anymore, because the more I uncovered, the more I realized that whatever happened to me in 1999 wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning. Days passed in a haze. Every morning, I woke up in my apartment, staring out at a world that felt less and less like my own. The city, once familiar, was now a labyrinth of glass and steel, a shining future that felt cold and unwelcoming. The people who walked the streets around me seemed disconnected, lost in their own worlds. Everyone was so wrapped up in their advanced technology, their constant chatter into invisible headsets, and their endless scrolling through devices I couldn't fully understand. I, on the other hand, was struggling with something far more fundamental. I wasn't just trying to adjust to the technological advancements around me. I was trying to understand who I had become, and what had happened to me in those missing years. My memories were slipping through my fingers like sand, and each time I thought I had a grip on something, it crumbled into nothingness. The dreams, no, the visions were getting worse. I couldn't sleep without seeing the same scenes, over and over again. In each one, I found myself standing in a vast, desolate place, a land that felt suspended in time. The air was thick, heavy, as if it carried the weight of years, decades, even centuries upon it. The ground beneath my feet was cracked and barren, the remnants of a world that had long since faded away. I wasn't alone in these visions. There were figures with me, always just out of reach, their faces blurred, their forms shrouded in shadow. And there was the man, the one who had been appearing in my dreams since I woke up in the hospital. He stood in the distance, watching me with those unsettling eyes that seemed to peer into the very core of my soul. "You've crossed the line," he would whisper, his voice carrying the weight of an eternity. "The timeline is fractured. You are the cause, and you are the solution. But you are also the danger." The words made no sense. I tried to make sense of them, to grasp at the meaning, but it was like trying to hold on to smoke. Every time I thought I understood, the message would shift, twist, and leave me more confused than before. I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. But then, things started happening that I couldn't explain away. I would be walking through the city, trying to go about my day, when I would suddenly feel a wave of dizziness, like the world itself was shifting beneath my feet. I'd see flashes of something, someone in the crowd, someone who shouldn't have been there. But when I looked again, they were gone. It was as if reality itself was bending, warping, and I was caught in the middle of it. One night, after another strange encounter, I found myself standing at the edge of a dark alley, staring at the screen of my phone. I wasn't sure why, but I had been following an address that had appeared in my dreams, in one of those fragmented visions. The address had been in my mind since I first woke up. I didn't know why it was there or what it meant, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was important. When I arrived at the location, I found myself standing in front of an old building, an abandoned warehouse, its windows shattered and its doors creaking in the wind. It looked like a place that had been forgotten by time, a relic of the past. But there was something inside, something calling to me. I entered the building cautiously, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the cold concrete walls. The air was thick with dust and decay, the faint scent of rust and rot in the air. And there, in the center of the room, was a table. On it lay a stack of old papers, yellowed with age. As I approached, a chill ran down my spine. The papers seemed familiar, like something I had seen before. I picked them up, my hands trembling, and began to read. The words on the papers were cryptic, fragments of a story that didn't make sense. But one line stood out, written in bold letters that seemed to burn into my mind. "The timeline is broken. You have crossed over, but you have also become the key to its restoration. The one who returns cannot remain in the same world they left. You are not who you think you are." I could feel my heart racing as I read the words again and again. What did it mean? I wasn't sure, but I knew deep down that these were the answers I had been looking for. The truth was out there, hidden in the shadows, waiting for me to uncover it. But as I stood there, reading those words, I felt a presence behind me. I turned around, my breath catching in my throat. There he was, the man from my dreams. He was standing in the doorway, his figure shrouded in darkness, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "You should not have come here," he said, his voice low and cold. "The timeline is fractured beyond repair. You are the one who broke it, and you are the one who must fix it. But know this, you cannot return to the life you knew. It is gone." The weight of his words hit me like a physical blow. Gone. The life I had known, the world I had left behind. Everything was gone, and I was left in a world that wasn't mine. a world I couldn't even begin to understand. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. I was trapped in a web of fate, caught between two worlds that I didn't belong to. And then the man spoke again. "Time is not what you think it is," he said. "It bends, it breaks, and it can be rewritten. But you have crossed into a world that was never meant for you. And now you must make a choice." I took a step back, my mind spinning. A choice? What choice? What was I supposed to do? The man's words hung in the air like a thick fog, wrapping around me, suffocating my thoughts. A choice. But what choice was there? How could I possibly choose anything when I had no understanding of what was happening to me, let alone the consequences of whatever decision I made? I felt the weight of his presence pressing down on me. His gaze was unyielding, his figure unmoving, but the feeling of being watched, studied, never left. I could feel his eyes on me, even as my body trembled, struggling to grasp the reality of what was unfolding. "You cannot remain here," the man continued, his voice cold, but laced with something that almost sounded like regret. "This world was never meant for you. The timeline is broken, and you are the fracture." I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Fracture? I was the fracture. The words felt heavy, suffocating, like a truth I wasn't ready to face. How could I have been the cause of all of this? What did he mean by the fracture? The man stepped forward, his silhouette shifting in the dim light of the warehouse, the shadows playing tricks with my mind. He wasn't entirely human. I could tell that now. There was something otherworldly about him, something ancient and powerful. His movements were fluid, almost predatory, and yet there was an undeniable aura of authority about him. "You are a product of time," he said, his voice deep and resonant, like the rumble of thunder on the horizon. "And time, like all things, can be bent, reshaped and controlled. But you—" He paused, his gaze hardening. "You broke it. You died, but you were not meant to return. And now, the fabric of time itself has been torn." The air in the room grew colder, and I shivered involuntarily. I couldn't understand it. None of it made sense. Why me? Why had I been chosen? Why had I returned? It wasn't just a resurrection. It was as if the universe itself had demanded that I come back. But why? I tried to speak, but my voice faltered. "What do you want from me? What do I have to do?" The man tilted his head, considering my question, as though the answer was simple, yet beyond my comprehension. He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving mine, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes, something almost sympathetic. "You are the key," he said, his voice softer now, though the weight of his words still pressed on me. "The timeline that you have returned to is not your own. The world you left behind in 1999 is gone. It has already been altered, just as you have been altered. The choices you make now will determine the future of not only this world, but all worlds that exist within the threads of time." I couldn't breathe. I felt like the walls of the warehouse were closing in on me. Time? Threads of time? Was I really hearing this? Or had I completely lost my grip on reality? I glanced around the room, trying to find some kind of anchor, something familiar to hold on to, but there was nothing. Just the eerie silence of the abandoned warehouse, the papers scattered on the table, and the man before me, who seemed to hold the answers to questions I didn't even know how to ask. "What do I have to do?" I repeated, my voice shaking, desperate for clarity. How do I fix it?" The man's expression darkened. "You must go back," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "You must go back to the moment you died. to the point where the fracture occurred, and you must make the choice to either sever the threads that bind you to this world, or reweave them and return to your own. The words hit me like a ton of bricks. Go back. How could I go back to the moment I died? I had no idea how any of this worked, let alone how to undo something that had already been done. But I can't, I said, almost pleading. I don't remember. I don't even remember what happened that night. I don't know how to go back. You don't need to remember, the man said. The memory is not the key. You are the key. You must decide, will you restore the timeline to what it was, or will you let it continue to fracture and unravel? I felt dizzy, like the ground was shifting beneath me. Restore the timeline? How could I do that? I didn't even know what had caused the fracture in the first place. Everything was so unclear, so out of reach. But I couldn't ignore the sense that my decision here, now, would shape the future in ways I couldn't comprehend. The man's expression softened, but his eyes were still piercing, unwavering. You are not who you once were. The moment you died, you became something else, a vessel of time itself, but the choice remains yours. What will you do? I stood there, motionless, caught in the swirl of confusion, fear, and the overwhelming weight of the decision I was about to make. The world felt like it was slipping through my fingers, slipping away from me, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't grasp it. What if I don't make a choice? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. The man's eyes flashed with something that could have been pity, or perhaps something darker. If you do not make a choice, the timeline will continue to break apart. The consequences will be irreversible, and you too will be lost in the rift. A chill ran down my spine at his words. I wouldn't let that happen. But I was still so lost. How could I make a choice when I didn't understand the rules of this game? When I didn't even know who I truly was anymore? The man seemed to sense my hesitation. The answer lies within you, he said softly. You only need to look inside yourself. You are the key. The power to restore the timeline is within you. I felt a surge of energy, a wave of warmth that washed over me, and for the briefest of moments, I could almost see the threads of time themselves, tangled and knotted, stretched out before me. The power to rewrite it all, to fix it, to return to the life I once knew, was right there, just out of reach. But was I willing to pay the price? The warmth that surged through me quickly dissipated, leaving me cold and uncertain once more. The man's words echoed in my mind, reverberating through every corner of my consciousness. You are the key. The power to restore the timeline is within you. It felt like a burden and a gift at the same time. Could I really alter the course of reality itself? Could I rewrite the events that had led me to this point and fix the fracture I had caused? As I stood there, caught between the pull of the past and the gravity of the present, I realized that the decision I had to make was not just about saving the timeline. It was about choosing who I would become. Who was I now? Was I the man I was before, the man who had died in 1999? Or was I something else entirely? The man before me, the one who had been guiding me through this twisted version of reality, watched me closely, waiting for my response. His eyes seemed to bore into mine, as if he were searching for something deep within me, something he already knew existed. I'd been thrust into a world I didn't recognize, with a past I couldn't remember, and a future that seemed to be slipping away from me. I had no answers, no sense of direction, and yet, here I was, being asked to make a choice that would determine not only my fate, but the fate of an entire world. My mind raced, my heart pounding in my chest. What was the right decision? If I chose to return to the past, to fix the timeline, what would I be giving up? The world I had woken up to, despite its strangeness, had started to become my reality. It was foreign, yes, but it was also full of possibilities. The future I was facing was not the one I had left behind. But perhaps that wasn't such a bad thing. Maybe I could find a new purpose here, in this fractured timeline. But then again, the man's warning lingered in my mind. If you do not make a choice, the timeline will continue to break apart. The consequences will be irreversible. What if I didn't choose? What if I couldn't choose? What would happen to the world and to me if I let everything unravel? I turned away from the man, pacing the cold, dusty floor of the warehouse. The tension in my chest was unbearable, the weight of the decision pressing down on me like a vice. Every step I took seemed to echo in the vast, empty space, as though the very air was charged with the weight of the unknown. I wanted to scream, to rip apart the fabric of this reality and force the answers out of it. Why was this happening to me? Why couldn't I just go back to the life I had before, to the world that was familiar, that made sense? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the world I had known no longer existed. It had been lost forever the moment I died, the moment I returned. The man's voice broke through my thoughts, his tone calm, yet filled with an undeniable authority. "You must decide now," he said. "Time waits for no one. You cannot remain in this world forever. If you do not act, the rift will consume you. You will cease to exist as you are." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I could feel the urgency in his voice, the gravity of the situation sinking in. There was no more time to hesitate, no more time to wonder if I was making the right choice. The choice had to be made, and it had to be made now. I stopped pacing and turned to face the man once more. My eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, I didn't feel fear. I felt a strange sense of clarity, as if something deep inside me was beginning to stir, something that had been buried since the moment I woke up in this strange future. I was the key. The man's gaze softened, though his expression remained unreadable. "You understand now," he said. "The timeline has been fractured, but it can be mended. You are the one who holds the power to do so." I nodded slowly, my heart still heavy with the weight of the decision. But deep down, I knew what I had to do. I had to return. I didn't know how, or even if I could, but the choice was clear. The timeline needed to be fixed. I couldn't let it continue to unravel. The future I had woken up to may have been strange and unfamiliar, but it was still a future I could fight for. The man stepped aside, as though allowing me to make the final decision in my own time. But I knew there was no more time to waste. I had already been gone too long, and the consequences of inaction would be far too great. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, my mind clear for the first time in days. "I'm ready," I said, my voice steady despite the fear that still gripped my heart. "I'll go back. I'll fix it." The man nodded, his eyes filled with something that almost resembled approval. "Then go," he said. "But remember this. Once you make the choice, there is no turning back. The timeline will be restored, but the price may be higher than you realize." And with that, the world around me began to shift. I felt a sudden rush of wind, and the ground beneath my feet seemed to buckle and twist. The warehouse disappeared, replaced by an overwhelming flash of light. The sensation was disorienting, like I was being pulled through time itself, a feeling of weightlessness that left me breathless. I closed my eyes, clenching my fists as I braced for what was to come. I had made my choice, and now there was no turning back. The sensation of being pulled through time was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was as if every fibre of my being was being stretched to its limits, as though I were being torn apart and stitched back together again. The world around me flickered like a broken film reel, flashes of light and colour blending together into a chaotic whirlpool. My body felt weightless, as though I were floating between two realities, caught in the rift of time itself. I couldn't tell how much time passed, or even if any time had passed at all. It was all a blur, a disorienting series of moments that blended together into a single eternity. I thought I might lose myself completely in the void, that I might be swallowed by the darkness of the rift. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sensation stopped. The world around me came into focus. I opened my eyes, my breath catching in my throat. I was standing in the middle of a street. My street. It was 1999 again. I could feel it in the air. The familiar scent of autumn leaves and the distant sound of traffic. The buildings around me. The people on the sidewalks. Everything was exactly as I remembered it. This was the world I had left behind. But something was off. I stood there for a moment, taking in the scene around me. It was as if I had stepped back in time, but I wasn't the same. I was different. I could feel it deep inside me, a sense of disconnection that tugged at my soul. The world I had returned to wasn't quite the same. I wasn't sure how, but I knew that things had shifted, even if only in subtle ways. I looked down at my hands, half expecting to see the same cold, unfamiliar skin that had greeted me when I first woke up in 2025. But no, my hands were the same as they had been before, warm and alive. I could feel my heartbeat in my chest, the steady thrum of life coursing through me. Yet, there was something different about the air, about the way the world felt. I turned around, searching for something familiar, and there in the distance, I saw her, Emily, my sister. She was walking toward me, her face a mixture of confusion and hope. She looked just as I remembered, her features unchanged by the years. But as she approached, I saw the look in her eyes, the hesitation that flickered there. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice trembling as she stopped in front of me. Her gaze searched my face, and I could see the pain in her eyes. You're not supposed to be here. You were gone." I felt a pang in my chest. Gone. That's what she had thought. That's what everyone had thought. "I know," I said, my voice hoarse, "but I'm here now." I could see the confusion in her eyes, the uncertainty of seeing me standing there, alive and whole. She didn't recognize me the way she had before. Not fully. It was as if the return had fractured something between us, something that couldn't be repaired so easily. You died," she whispered, more to herself than to me. "How is this possible?" I opened my mouth to explain, but the words caught in my throat. How could I explain this? How could I explain the choice I had made, the price of my return, and the cost it had come with? I had returned to 1999, to the life I had left behind. But I wasn't the same. The world wasn't the same. The threads of time had been restored, yes, but they had also been broken. Something had changed. Something was different. And no matter how hard I tried to fit myself back into the world I once knew, I knew deep down that I would never truly belong here again. As I looked at Emily, I realized the painful truth. I had made the right choice, but it had come at a price. The timeline had been restored, but my return had come with consequences that I couldn't fully comprehend. The threads of time had been rewoven, yes, but they had also been twisted. I had changed. The world had changed, and there was no going back. The man, the one who had guided me through the rift of time, had warned me of this. He had told me that the choice would come with a price. But I had never fully understood what that meant until now. My return had altered the course of history in ways I couldn't predict. And now I was left to live with the consequences. I looked around, trying to find something familiar, something that could anchor me to this world. But the more I looked, the more I realized that the world I had returned to was not the one I had left behind. It was a world that had been shaped by my absence, by the decisions I had made in the past. And now it was up to me to find my place in it. As Emily reached out to touch my arm, I could see the tears welling up in her eyes. "You're really here," she whispered. "But where have you been? What happened?" I didn't have an answer. I couldn't explain everything to her. Not yet. The timeline was intact, but the world I had returned to was not my own. I was no longer the man I had been in 1999. I was a different person, a person shaped by the events that had transpired in the years I had been gone. And as I stood there, looking at my sister and the world I had returned to, I realized that the greatest mystery was not what had happened to me in the years I had been gone, but what would happen next. The threads of time had been restored, but the future was uncertain, and now I had to find my way forward in a world that was no longer mine.